With that, I would like to hand over the session to the chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Nice, for organizing this conference on Nepal's foreign policy and inviting me to chair this particular session. Good afternoon from New Delhi. My name is Angshuman Choudhury. I am a senior researcher at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies here in Delhi. And I feel honored to be moderating this very, very distinguished panel on an absolutely critical issue that's central to Nepal's foreign policy, in fact. So central that it's often been a key determinant of Nepal's relations with its neighbors, especially India. Just a few housekeeping, rules that or information that I would like to give you. This session goes on for an hour, 60 minutes. I think what we can do here is, let the speaker speak for about 40 minutes and then use the rest of the time to address questions. I will be collecting the questions from the chat box and perhaps also be using my moderator's privilege to perhaps ask a few questions on my own if there are no questions. But if we have enough questions from the audience, I would let those questions take priority since it's great to have an engagement. As I said, we have four very, very distinguished speakers today and subject matter experts on this issue. I wouldn't say much on this on this topic, and I would let the experts, talk about this. I think they're very, very well, particularly well placed to speak about this. So without much ado, I would go to our first speaker, Mr. Dipak Gyawali, who is a former Minister of Water Resources in the government of Nepal. Mr. Gyawali, please, the floor is yours for the next 8 to 9 minutes.
Thank you. When you say hydro-diplomacy, prospects and opportunities for Nepal, what struck me with the title was it should have been prospects and opportunities for the basin riparians, because this diplomacy is needed as much for India and Bangladesh, and for that matter, Bhutan, as Nepal. Okay. That's my first observation. Now, I'm going to put in the chat box a few of the, in 8 minutes, there's little one can really get into depth, but I'll put in the chat box some of the writings from where I am coming from, which are in the public domain on hydrodiplomacy and on the transboundary water issues. The problem, the main problem is, that I'm going to talk about basically three things. Why hydrodiplomacy, what is hydrodiplomacy, and how hydrodiplomacy actually functions. Okay, so the first one is, the reason we need this hydrodiplomacy is because of it's to avoid the kind of absolutely debilitating impasse that we are now seeing. Okay, Mahakali Treaty done well. We're celebrated the 25th. What is it? Non-anniversary, anniversary. I don't know what to call it. Just finished, and I have a piece in one of the Nepali papers on that, a longish piece. Interestingly, when the Mahakali Treaty it's dead in the water right now. It's not moved an inch. What the treaty stipulated should be done in 6 months has not been done in 25 years. It stipulated something must be done in 2 years. It hasn't been done in 25 years. And it said it should be revised 10 years or earlier, and it's 25 years, but nothing has moved and nobody has taken a step, not Nepal, not India, to revise it. So if it hasn't moved for 25 years, there's something basically wrong with it. Okay. So why this impasse? Actually, it points to a massive, massive failure on the part of both India and Nepal of hydrodiplomacy. So there must be something stuck somewhere, which is neither side is willing to, put out in the open. Okay, and that is why it is stuck. Its logic is as simple as that. Now, one more, brutal fact: when the Mahakali Treaty was signed, Sher Bahadur Deuba was the prime minister 25 years ago. Today, he is still the prime minister. When it was signed, the leaders of the opposition were Madhav Nepal and KP Oli. And rather than be opposition to the treaty, they were choir masters of the treaty much more than the ruling party itself. In fact, KP Oli is on record as saying that the moment we sign this treaty, Nepal will be getting 1 trillion 20 billion rupees per annum I mean, India would have to pay something like 27 rupees per unit of electricity for that to happen. But this is the kind of hype that went on. Now, interestingly, it's the same lot that are in the same position of power even right now as I speak, okay? So diplomacy is obviously needed here to be able to move away from this impasse to something more meaningful, a more meaningful cooperation in many aspects of water and energy development, flood control, you name it, okay? Inland navigation, that's a new thing that's come up from India since 2015 after the act was signed and so on. But nothing has moved. There are something like 16 Nepal, India committees, ministerial, secretarial, flood commissions and, energy, this thing and all that, something like 16 of them. And each one of them is supposed to meet at least twice a year, I understand. Well, many of them haven't met for years. Why? Because there's probably something underlying, that neither side wants to put on the agenda formally. So this is where hydro diplomacy comes in, that, you should be able to find out and then find a comfortable way for everybody to move forward. And it is not happening. Now, to do that, we've got to be able to be very clear what is hydro diplomacy. Okay. The first point I need to make is that it's very different from policy. Policy, water policy or foreign policy, these are open documents. These are openly stated, okay? Policy, I believe it's Henry Kissinger who said that, but maybe somebody even wiser and earlier than him, that policy is a formula for the use of power. Now, every country, every individual, every business establishment, every NGO has quote unquote power of different types, okay? How they use that policy is, how they use that power is the stated policy. Okay? Now, that is out in the open. There's no need to worry about that. Diplomacy is just the exact opposite. It is, even though diplomats should be well versed in the nuances and details of policies of their respective countries and their host countries, diplomacy is about trying to find out the nuances behind the use of that power that is not out in the open. That is kutniti, policy that is hidden. There's an open policy and there's a hidden policy. So there's something hidden about the use of force, moral force, persuasive power, coercive power, any one of them. And this type of power, when it is exercised, is what needs to be found. And diplomacy is about trying to find the use of persuasion and moral imperatives that do not require the use of coercive force. Okay, so this is where we should be working on diplomacy. This is where hydro diplomacy should be. Unfortunately, it is, and it is not working. And let me tell you why. It's not working, obviously, because none of these bilateral meetings that should have been held long time ago with all these 16 different committees and subcommittees, they're not held, or even if they are held, I once joked that they might as well do it by fax. If they are going to just reiterate their previous positions, why bother meeting at all? Okay, so where diplomacy has to come in is at three levels, I would argue. One is the most important, and it is happening at that level. And when I explain this, let me first state that, for example, I don't believe that Mahakali, the impasse of Mahakali, is a Nepal-India problem. Nepali hydrocrats and Indian hydrocrats are hell-bent on building that 300-meter high dam, believe me. There is really no disagreement among them. The problem is that, there are other forces that do not like it, okay? And these are mostly social and environmental activists, a lot of academics, both in India and Nepal, in Uttarakhand. And let's not forget, Uttarakhand was formed 2 years after the Mahakali Treaty was signed. And as a result, it has completely changed the dynamics of what that treaty can or should be like. Uttarakhandis have the same problem with Uttar Pradesh as Nepal has with India, upstream, downstream problem. Okay, the blunt answer being, why should we drown our villages, forests, everything else, just so that Uttar Pradesh gets free water or very cheap water? And this is a fundamental question that needs to be addressed. This is where hydro diplomacy comes in. So most of the diplomacy currently is being done at the academic and activist level. What you and I are doing right now is academic, diplomacy, hydro diplomacy. The other one is business communities and their professional organizations. Business communities see things very differently from the activist community. And between them, they also can come in, and they do come in, to explain and find out what is wrong, what is going on, and give appropriate feedback to their respective governments. Okay? But most obviously, it is governments that should be doing it. And I'm going to close by basically arguing, and I'm finished. I'm going to argue that governments should do it, but governments should be the court of last resort. That is, you can't get two secretaries to meet when there's an impasse and then have more impasse at the end of it. It is better if governments encourage track 2, track 1.5, I call it, track 3, maybe even track 5. I don't know, you can have any amount of tracks here, okay? And get them to sort out some of these very, very difficult, thorny issues. And governments should be able to then get a feedback, not commit themselves. In this track 2 meetings, government representatives should not speak, because government is the final court, okay? So if that happens, then the governments should also have within them non-siloed and what I call nexus institutions. Nepal does, okay, and India does too. The Water Commission, the Central Electricity Authority, these are important bodies. Nepal's Water and Energy Commission is an important structurally nexused body because it has 12 secretaries, ministry of 12 different ministries pertaining to water and energy in that. The mistake there is it has been made to chair by the water energy minister, and then the other secretaries just don't give a hang. They should have had rotational ministership or chairmanship from 12 different ministries. And similarly, they should have had, and this is there in Dr. Dwarika Dhungel's book, and I've written about it, so he can talk about it. But, so if you have nexus institutions like that, they can see problems of water because water is life. It is related to everything, okay? Water is not just irrigation. And Indian hydrocracy's problem is to see water only as irrigation, not a drop wasted to the sea has been the motto from British days till today, which is why that 111 waterways in India idea is not moving forward because it is completely counter to this idea of not wasting a drop to the sea. If you have inland navigation, you've got to get water right up to the sea. Okay, so there are severe fundamental problems over there, and these need from the government side also certain kind of nexus arrangements, nexus institutional arrangements, like Nepal's Water and Energy Commission, which unfortunately has been misused, okay, as a shunting yard for unwanted bureaucrats, okay, rather than used for its capacity to solve nexus problems. So if we do this, and if we have hydro diplomacy at all these three levels, in the market realm, in the activist realm, academic realm, and in the government realm, then perhaps we can come, and the government realm coming in as the court of last resort, then I think we'll get somewhere. I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gyawali. I very much appreciate your candor in discussing these points. I think platforms like these.
I'm not a diplomat, I just say it like it is, okay?
Yes, I mean, and certainly, and platforms like these are exactly where we need to have frank conversations on these issues, because I don't think those happen at very much at a diplomatic level. And it's interesting how you point out certain internal fissures within India, for instance, between Uttarakhand and UP, and the fact that Nepal needs to be aware of these in order for hydro diplomacy to function well. And also the sort of top-heavy bureaucratic structure within the Indian government that deals with water resources. And it's also notable that you argued that the governments are doing hydro diplomacy. It's the activists and academics who are doing that. So there needs to be more interface between the government and academics on this. The next speaker that we have is from India, Dr. Uttam Sinha, who's a research fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Dr. Sinha, please, the floor is yours for the next 8 to 9 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair, and very good to see Dipak ji after a long time. And I guess very soon we'll be interacting again. Dipak ji said nothing really moves in South Asia, except, I guess, rebels, and that too we try to stop it. Often when I talk and I look at South Asia, we miss a very striking element that we must keep asking ourselves, is that South Asia is a riverine neighborhood, and rivers play an intrinsic part in the overall growth and development of the region. Of course, it does create its own bad blood, misperception, lack of transparency, etc. But I think the most important part from a political scientist perspective is that it does create interdependencies through its complex network of environmental, economic, and security issues. So rivers are political because they are very territorial. But these interdependencies can either reinforce the relationship or even sort of create disturbances. And I think that is a very important part. But it does, and the history has shown in South Asia, that there's enormous space that is being created for integration and cooperation with these interdependencies. I think this is a very strong characteristic of South Asian states, which we must emphasize in our larger understanding of South Asia. But I think the question that remains, and I think Dipak was trying to make up, is that whether the various treaties and arrangements that we have between countries on rivers in South Asia, whether they have been really optimized, and if not, what are the constraints really that stop these arrangements, which are very marvelously constructed with a lot of technical and engineering emphasis and also a lot of political understanding. And yet, there's no concrete forward movement on these very well crafted arrangements. I think this is something to really consider. It's a sort of an irony that exists in South Asia in many senses. And I think possibly if we evaluate it, the whole framing, I think, is quite wrong. I think politically in South Asia, there has to be greater efforts towards a cooperative management framework, which we do realize, but it doesn't really look at water as a public good. It doesn't seem to integrate security and development in a neat, balanced way. And it doesn't really think in terms of long-term perspectives in a sustainable way. And I think this framing would be very important now as we move forward on thinking about the rivers in South Asia. Another framing that goes wrong is the whole nexus analysis, the food, energy, water nexus analysis, and that needs to be critically introduced into the interdependencies of the states in South Asia. When you construct and when you look at the cooperative management framework in the future, I think these ideas are very important because an integrated region has to be looked at not in silos, but through a more interdisciplinary, interministerial, a very multi-sectoral kind of an approach. And I think that has been largely lacking in our earlier understanding of water cooperations in South Asia. And I think probably it is time, I think, to have a much sort of a robust sub-regional river basin organization, that includes Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal. So it's not just bilateral anymore. The space has increased and it becomes multi-state participation now in the whole understanding. Finally, the point which I really might like to make in my brief time that I have is that we are going to see a greater traction, a greater movement towards beyond the bilateral framing of things. And we must realize that the whole, South Asia, we often miss, we are great inheritors of the ancient ways of things, the ancient civilization, river civilization, which laid great emphasis on ensuring abundance food and sharing the products among the living. It was the principle of righteous public function or dharma. I think we should realize this as we look at South Asia, look at its aspiration, look at its regional development. I think that will be an added value to the way we conceive the rivers, I think. Rivers are also not just about water, I think. The tragedy in South Asia has been, the water treaties have been greatly influenced by politics, hegemony, and interest. I think we should factor that and make some course corrections in the future. Of course, diplomacy will play a very important role, undoubtedly. And I think the value of diplomacy here is that it has the ability to sort of reach out to various other stakeholders, the engineers, the civil society. I think that's the whole idea. Diplomacy brings knowledge, value, people together. I think that would be required. But one has to ask the question really is, then what kind of diplomats would you require in South Asia? Diplomats are largely generalists, I think. But I think the whole idea of diplomacy is really to scale the knowledge of the diplomats in South Asia, make them understand what rivers are, give them adequate reading materials when they start off as probationers, make them have more interaction with engineers, make them get the feel of what the civil society feels, how emotive they are. I think there are ways to introduce this whole idea of rivers and the whole idea of hydrodiplomacy in South Asia. Of course, we have to be very innovative, and I might just throw some ideas to think about. I think we have to start thinking in different ways. For example, in South Asia, I do not notice any joint water conclave meetings between, for example, political leaders and editors, of the media, of newspapers, etc. I think we need more interaction on that front, because one of the biggest things that we miss in rivers and waters are, how badly we know about it. There's a whole lot of misperception and misinformation on rivers that can only be cleared when we have these kind of better interaction at various levels. Also, I think it's required now in South Asia, especially when you look at India and Nepal, or even between India and Bangladesh, for example, that we need provincial leaders and local thinking to emerge. And not just between Delhi and Kathmandu or Delhi and Dhaka. I think there's a larger space here to bring in new knowledge and understanding. The Nepal, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Bangladesh, West Bengal, Assam, Tripura, Bhutan, it just expands. And I think that whole integration of that provincial understanding, the local feel is quite important. Of course, we need to involve economists, business leaders, young entrepreneurs. South Asian leaders, rush to Davos to attend that great economic summit. We should have our own regional Davos here and bring in these larger stakeholder participation here. There's always a desire, I think, in South Asia to have very inter-country parliamentary groups, especially on water-related disaster management. And I think that is an element that might be very critical in finding ways forward, why things are not really moving forward. I think these kind of forums will be quite useful. And I think lastly, it's sometimes very important symbolically to mark certain days, designate certain days as friendship days or great water days, Bangladesh India Friendship Day, India Nepal Friendship Day, and bring in the values of water cooperation that we have had in the last 5 to 6 decades. That understanding and that knowledge, I think, is quite critical. So we have to be innovative. We have to respect the rivers in South Asia. We have to also pat on our back, some of the cooperations that we had in the past. India and Nepal has had over 100 years of water cooperation, water understanding. I think that knowledge of the past is equally important when we move forward. So there's a lot to do, of course. There's a lot we have done. I think both these two needs to converge as we manage what is, I think, a very critical, vital and crucial resource for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sinha. I think you made some very, very crucial points, especially from the solution point of view. And you reminded us of the fundamental premise on which we are operating, that the South Asian subcontinent is essentially a subcontinent of rivers, and which essentially creates so many interdependencies. Paradoxically, can create both competition and cooperation. I also found your point about how this entire framing of water is not correct, is faulty. That we don't look at water as a public good, and there's no sort of long-term thinking in a sustainable way. I think that's extremely crucial. And I mean, in general, I think one of the problems that you highlighted, which is sort of, I would say, it's a running thread within South Asian cooperation, or should I say non-cooperation, is that there is great difficulty in doing things together across the board, be it in trade, connectivity, or security, right? So I think you brought that out well within the water domain also. And I found this question implicit in your point that diplomacy has to be a multi-stakeholder exercise. It has to have knowledge from other domains also. And I found this question implicit in that you were perhaps asking, do we need specialist diplomats within the water domain, within the hydrodiplomacy domain, diplomats who are particularly adept at negotiating water treaties? So I think that I found that interesting, and something that I myself was thinking before this webinar, which you mentioned well, that South Asia lacks things like a joint water conclave, where multiple stakeholders can perhaps come under the same roof and discuss these issues. And lastly, I think your point about greater integration of this sort of what you call provincial understanding between various regions and sub-regions in the subcontinent, I think that's extremely crucial and particularly important for sort of India-Nepal hydro diplomacy, and that there has to be transfer of knowledge from one knowledge sector to another. So I think these are extremely good points, and I've certainly taken note of these, and will be passing it on to some of my colleagues who look into these issues. Moving on, the next speaker that we have is Dr. Dwarika Nath Dhungel, who's a senior researcher within the social sciences domain. Dr. Dhungel, you have about the floor is yours, and you have about 8 to 9 minutes to make your remarks.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Do you hear
Yes.
me?
Clearly, sir.
Thank you. First of all, good afternoon from Kathmandu to all of you. I would like to thank organizers for giving me this opportunity and to hear people like Dipak, Gyawali ji, Uttam ji, and would be hearing others also. I would rather like to touch on the basis of the topic given. The topic given to us this afternoon is hydrodiplomacy, problems and opportunities for Nepal. So this is more, I think, from the perspective of Nepal for providing the feedback and getting the feedback from the eminent scholars to the policymakers in Nepal. So I would be I'll be speaking for another 5 to 6 or 7 minutes on that. First of all, I think now time has come for us to move out from hydro diplomacy to water diplomacy. We have been talking this hydro diplomacy. I don't know why organizers decided to have it. Maybe they thought that Nepal has a possibility of exploiting the water just for the sake of producing hydro. And there are people who think that Nepal would be rich by selling electricity to India. The situation is not that case. I would give you the figure now. The figure is, as per Nepal Electricity Authority latest report, out of the capacity which we are using, which we have, as per August 2021 report, it's 38% of the power which we are consuming is being imported from India. That is a fact. Whereas we are only exporting 39 megawatt to India. That too, India has not opened us for all the projects that are being funded through different sources. India has permitted us to only export the energy that is being produced by the plants established with the help of Government of India, that is Trishuli and Dipak. Furthermore, people are talking, there's a change in the attitude on the part of the Indian bureaucracy in terms of import and export of power from the neighboring countries. They refer to the guidelines of 2016 and now the 2019. The fact remains that the right to give permission for export and import is now with the Government of India. And that is the situation, meaning the government is still holding the right to exercise its power, authority, whether to allow the export or import of power from the neighboring country. That is the situation. So therefore, I think in terms of per capita consumption in Nepal, we are still not that high. So from this perspective also, probably for our policy makers who are handling this issue to start now thinking in terms of producing more for our consumption and see and only think of the export. That also is dependent on the permission of the government of India. So having said that, I think so the issue in terms of relationship, diplomacy, from the perspective of Nepal as a researcher, as somebody who had worked in the water resources sector for some years in the past within the bureaucracy. Now, I think the organizers and scholars like you and us, now we have to think in terms of water diplomacy. Water diplomacy. So, as rightly pointed out here by the speaker, that we are connected by South Asia is connected by the rivers. And let's take the example of the sub-regional point of view. Ganges is the river that connects us. It's not only Nepal, India, Bangladesh, but also the Tibet is Tibetan Autonomous Region of the People's Republic of China is also connected. So therefore, if we have to think, but I'm happy that somebody spoke here. Now we have to move from bilateralism to multilateralism. Let me very humbly remind you that when King Birendra in 1970s proposed for Israelism in terms of the water cooperation, and also during the SAARC conference, we were told that the smaller nations are ganging up against the bigger nation. That means the India. And for example, it was in 2003, 2004, we had a meeting organized by ORF in Delhi, called Nepal-India Relationship Challenges Ahead. I had presented a paper on water relationship between the two countries, and exactly in that that has come out in the publication, and in the publication it has former Secretary Maharaja Rasgotra has been quoted there, and he said it that India did not like to support the idea of King Birendra, which was supported by Bangladesh. Let's go for regionalism, because it was thought that smaller nations ganging up against us. But now we are happy that at least there is a change of thinking in terms of change of thinking among the academia. I hope there will be change of thinking among the bureaucrats in New Delhi also. But that also we have to also keep in mind that it's not only we would not like to be the part of we would very much like to be the part of the sub-regional dialogue, but not in the form of ganging up against any other country. That also has to be understood clearly. So from this perspective, I'm happy that we are now, at least there is a change of mindset. I feel there is some thinking is going on in terms of changing the attitude in Delhi also. And we know the Bangladesh is interested, and Dipak ji is here. We had a couple of discussion in terms of the Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna cooperation, and we also had a discussion on the basis of the Mekong exercise in Delhi, also in Calcutta. So having said that, I'm happy. I would like to suggest to our policymakers, they should forget of now the hydro diplomacy, rather they should think of water diplomacy with our neighboring countries, because we are connected to water. In terms of our relationship in terms of our relationship with India and Bangladesh in the field of water sector. We have long relationship with India going back to 100 years, but the latest one started 1954. And three major treaties have been signed, the Koshi, Gandak, Mahakali. But when one does the content analysis of the committees that have been formed, and the discussion of the committees formed to deal with the issues of these treaties, hardly one would find satisfaction. Hardly one would be finding satisfaction in terms of the implementation of the treaty. So the question is whether we would like to have the treaty for treaty's sake, or we want to implement the treaty for the benefit of the people of both the countries. Mahakali Treaty, fortunately or unfortunately, I was one of the persons who negotiated with the government of India, Mahakali Treaty. And now I'm finding myself a stranger in when I see the implementation process. Where is it? So therefore, yes, we have to leave. Definitely, we have to live with our neighbors, and we have to have the agreement with our neighbors in terms of the use of the resources. And definitely, India, and also we have understandings with Bangladesh. And I myself have attended a couple of meetings in Bangladesh. And when we meet in Bangladesh, Bangladesh friends, they tell us, look, we have to cooperate. And we tell them, look, yes, we have to cooperate, but we have to have India also. So long as India does not sit together, there's no point. So if you look at, go to the website of the Ministry of Water Resources, the government of Nepal, and read the minutes of various meetings that have taken place, concrete decisions. Always we avoid to take the concrete decisions, and the meeting would end saying we would continue the discussion. Probably the time has come, and I myself have also I had the opportunity to organize the Track 2 exercise as somebody who was the executive director of Institute for Integrated Development Studies, a policy research institute. We had run a Track 2 exercise with CPR, New Delhi, and also BUP, Bangladesh. We talk at the professional level. We agree. We know that we have to work together. When it comes to giving the concrete shape, something happens, and it's always the security. Definitely, security has to be there in terms of dealing with the countries. But therefore, what I'm saying, I have been proposing to my friends, let us not think from the point of view of only ourselves. Let us see who is equally responsible, who is responsible for action and non-action of understandings reached, it is signed, and where do we want to move? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dhungel, for your, again, frank and very insightful remarks, particularly the fact that you as a negotiator of the Mahakali Treaty feels, if I may put it that way, disillusioned with how the treaty has been implemented or not implemented. I think there cannot be a more sort of, I would say, honest sort of evaluation of the post-treaty period or the treaty itself. And I found it very fascinating how you argued for a shift from from hydro diplomacy to water diplomacy. And perhaps I would like to come to this later during the discussion as to what in your mind are the exact aspects of the shift, or how you envision this shift. And I also liked how you problematize this very argument of moving from bilateralism to multilateralism, from Nepal's point of view, that when Nepal tried to do it, the counter argument that came from countries like India was that smaller countries were ganging up against bigger countries. And I like how you sort of pointed that there is a change in mindset across the board, and hope that there is a greater change in mindset within the Indian establishment also. So I think these are points that all stakeholders need to ponder over. Our last speaker is Udisha Saklani, who is a PhD scholar in the University of Cambridge. Ms. Saklani, please go ahead. You have the floor for the next
Thanks.
8 to 9 minutes.
Angshuman, I just wanted to ask you, do you think it's possible for me to just quickly share my slides?
Sure, I think, are you a co-host by any chance?
Yes, I think I am. Let me just try and share my screen.
Please. Sure.
Okay, great.
Yes.
So I just have 5 slides. I thought it would be useful for me to just use this. I just wanted to begin by saying how privileged I feel to be a part of this panel. I've been very lucky to meet some of the speakers during my PhD fieldwork, which was in 2019. So I'm going to quickly, I don't know how much I can actually add to some of the wisdom that has been shared on this platform, but what I intend to do today is to try and bring a slightly more theoretical perspective to this this theme, largely looking at what scholars have said about hydrodiplomacy and how we can find a way to essentially make a breakthrough. So, I'd like to begin on a slightly more optimistic note, which is to say that to some level, I think there has been some successful cases of water cooperation. So to begin with, for instance, when it comes to early warning systems, we all know that unfortunately institutional structures and the infrastructure for disaster mitigation and management, particularly in relation to floods, have not been adequate. Floods have been a persistent problem between India and Nepal for many, many years. However, there has been some cooperation that has been taking place at the official level and through NGOs as well. And an example of that would be an Indian NGO, Purvanchal Gramin Vikas Sansthan, which along with practical action and Christian aid has succeeded in significantly reducing the number of deaths from flooding in India as well as Nepal. And they did this by essentially developing a cross-border community-based early warning system, right, through capacity enhancement. So that's been one example of some level of successful cooperation, but of course we have a long way to go. Another has been ecosystem protection, which in which case the IUCN back in 2015-16, I was looking at some of their programs, and they had initiated a project to engage experts and stakeholders in Nepal as well as India to work together to develop a binational transboundary conservation action plan, essentially to conserve the Ganges River dolphin. Again, there have been small initiatives like that, but it does sort of give you some sense that there is hope for cooperation. The third being Hydropower Cooperation. The biggest example of that is the Indian public sector company Arun 3 investing in Nepal. The Indian public sector company SJVN essentially investing in the Arun 3 project. The Upper Karnali project should have also taken off, but that's been on a standstill for many, many years. The fourth example is that of shared learning. So a few concrete cases would be where best practices have been replicated. Say when it comes to the renovation of Sikkim Springs, it has actually attracted experts from Nepal as well as Bhutan to deploy lessons in the region. So when it comes to water cooperation, and if you're not only looking at rivers, but also other forms of water sources, there have been some steps which have been taken. However, largely, if you look at the landscape, the approach to water diplomacy and treaty formation has been extremely conventional, which means that the primary role has been taken up by political leaders, legal experts who've negotiated and decided projects. And unfortunately, the mindset has been very centered to building infrastructure. So the bureaucratic arm of the government kind of feels responsible to allocate and redistribute water, which is fine. But what that leads to is that such treaties end up homogenizing the socio-economic diversities in relation to water management. So that is one of the major features of this landscape. The second has been that there has been very poor implementation compliance, even to the provision of treaties. And it can be said that the treaties themselves need to be questioned, because for a very long time, Nepal has felt quite shortchanged in terms of some of the particularly the first two water treaties that were signed between India and Nepal. And even the compliances that exist, they've just, the implementation has been quite poor. Thirdly, there's a dominantly sectoral approach, and Mr. Dipak Gyawali talked about how there is a need to kind of look at the nexus of water, food, as well as energy. There is, I mean, this conversation has been going on in academia for a very long time, but it has not actually translated into practice on the ground. Fourth is there is poor flow of information, which kind of limits grounded decision making. Part of this also has to do with the fact that local communities are not actually involved in the conversations around rivers. And finally, basic governance principles such as accountability, transparency, flow and access to information, systematic checks, these have not been in place. So very quickly, what does the literature say about hydro diplomacy? So if you were to understand diplomacy as the management of state relations through formal negotiations, then hydro diplomacy is not just limited to taking a water-centric approach to state relations, but also understanding how actors manage the meaning of water. So essentially, again, going back to what Mr. Dipak Gyawali said, that there are certain implicit things related to water which don't actually come out on the surface. And I think involving those in our discussions become extremely important. And how do we do that? So that's where non-state actors will end up playing a huge role in essentially broadening the meaning around how is water being socially as well as politically constructed. And by water, I mean not just surface water, but also things like biodiversity, wetlands, etc. So the reason why this becomes important is that the moment we start paying attention to the multiple meanings of water, we will automatically begin with diversifying the nature of factors who are actually involved here, and start taking an approach that goes beyond the state-centric examination of networks and stakeholders engagement, right? So at the heart of hydro diplomacy, literature says that adaptive governance principles need to be in place. What do I mean by that? So that essentially means moving away from a static water resources management prescription, and instead sort of adopting an approach which looks at engagement and knowledge exchange with diverse stakeholders. And there are 5 critical pillars here. One would be social learning, which essentially refers to understanding whether we have shared definitions and conceptual understandings about things such as climate change impacts, resilience, as well as regional vulnerability. It seems like even the stakeholders who are involved in the conversation, they don't exactly agree on what it means for instance, Nepal to be resilient, and for what do we mean by climate change impacts, and what priorities within that need to be taken into account. The second is sustained relationships. At the heart of it involves trust And that is an issue which creates a lot of contention because India and Nepal have historically had their issues in terms of trusting one another. The third, which I thought was an important pillar, is that of flexibility, and that essentially allows the crafting of subsidiary agreements within the existing treaties. So how can we find a way to include things such as water quality, groundwater, say even conservation and innovations in managing shortage, environmental protection. So some of these aspects that might not have been mentioned in the previous treaties, can we find a way to bring some of those things on board and have a conversation around that, given that the entire landscape seems to be changing all thanks to climate change? So that's the third one. The fourth would be looking at state and non-state actors. I've talked a little bit about this, essentially mapping with different stakeholders, the legislators in parliament, government agencies, community-based institutions, development partners and donors, etc. And finally, the role of robust institutions. So in one of Mr. Gyawali's paper, I read a recommendation around kind of using the SARC chartered institutions, which all governments have already signed on to and try. I mean, these might not have achieved much, but is there a way for us to bring, to try and use these existing vehicles to go somewhere and, like, instead of actually investing in inventing some new institutions? So that would be the last one. And my final slide kind of looks at opportunities for meaningful cooperation. So I think three clear points came out while I was doing my field work, one of which is that water, and I think this conversation has been going on in EU as well, that instead of looking at water as something that has to be harnessed or exploited, can we also look at it as an instrument of peace, and which means that water needs to be a priority topic at whenever it comes to any form of regional cooperation, because there is a joint understanding of the fact that if India and Nepal do not agree on this particular theme, it's going to be very difficult for the two countries to try and cooperate on any other form of security, whether it is food security, energy security, even human security as well. So looking at water as an instrument of peace becomes extremely important. The second would be to try and follow a networked approach to water diplomacy. And Ashish Nandi, in one of his papers, talks about how SARC essentially is a collective of reluctant states. So can we try and move towards building a community of states and try and sort of desecuritize water and form communities around rivers, instead of necessarily looking at water as something that has to be protected just for the sake of the interest of one country over the other. And finally, the third would be finding ways to localize water diplomacy. And by that, I mean bridging the gap between macro as well as micro discourses. So macro discourses would refer to the more geopolitical discourses around rivers, and micro would refer to the more geocultural ones. So the kind of lived experiences that borderland communities have, can we try and capitalize on those to bring communities on board and find a way to actually work with the upstream as well as downstream communities? I think that would be one way to kind of try and find new ways to cooperate on issues related to water. So that's all from me for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Udisha. I think that was fantastic, actually. You, in fact, brought up some of the aspects that I myself had in mind in terms of questions, for instance, the impact of climate change, and the way you sort of brought out the theoretical paradigm. I think in this particular case, it goes beyond just normative abstract theory, because It helps us, sort of broaden and deepen this domain, which can actually have tangible effects on how hydro diplomacy is conducted. And I think the one takeaway from your presentation for me is that water is as much a social resource as a political or geopolitical resource. In fact, I would argue, and you have also perhaps argued in that sense, that it's more of a social resource. It's something that the political leadership on both sides needs to understand. So I think that was very fascinating. Unfortunately, we just have a couple more minutes to wrap up, and I've been asked to be very strict with time. So I don't think we'll have time to discuss all the bunch of questions that perhaps I had in my mind, because we did cover a lot of ground today. However, firstly, I would like to thank the panelists for sharing the literature here. I think that's very, very helpful. On the chat box, please, those of you who are interested in following up, please take note of this. We have, I think, one question, which is a critical question. I don't think we can talk about, let's say, hydro diplomacy in the largest Southern Asian region without talking about China. So if any one of you would like to take this up, we have a question from Mr. Vishnu Raju Preti, that it would be very useful for us audiences to listen about China in hydro diplomacy. There are various ways to actually frame this question more specifically, but I will keep it open-ended and perhaps just ask, how do you see China's role in hydro diplomacy in the Indian subcontinent, particularly in issues that relate to India and Nepal, given that we are in a time of a tectonic, almost arguably a tectonic geopolitical shift in terms of a rising, an aspirational superpower being in our neighborhood, and automatically leading to securitization of hydro diplomacy. So if anyone...
I'll take a crack if you will say.
Please, Mr. Gyawali.
Okay. See, China is one of the luckiest countries in the world that is upstream almost of everybody. Okay. It's not downstream of anybody else, except way up in Amur or some such place, which really isn't a problem for them. That's the first thing. Second, when it comes to the Ganga Basin or the Brahmaputra, where China is upstream, bigger part of the Kosi Basin is in China, let's not forget, not in India or Nepal. China cannot hope to use, or does not, as far as we understand here in Nepal, cannot use any of the waters. Water doesn't flow uphill, it flows downhill, okay? So, the idea of even Brahmaputra diversion makes no sense to most Chinese academics I talk to, okay? Electricity, it's the Chinese main sources of the places where they use electricity is too far away. It's easier from Karnali to draw a straight transmission line to Singapore or Baghdad than it is to Xi'an in China. It's too far away. Okay, so China's interest is really purely business. In all the developments, they would either like to be civil contractors or equipment suppliers. Okay, so that is where China's interest is, and I'm afraid they're doing it so damn well. They have outcompeted everybody else, especially the Europeans. They've completely outcompeted the Europeans and the Americans in supply of electromechanical equipment. So Chinese diplomacy is to be seen completely different as a supplier diplomacy, as opposed to Indian or Bangladeshi or Nepali ones, which is also of a use diplomacy. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Gyawali. Is there, out of the other speakers, would you, any one of you like to take a shot at the question? Then please feel free to.
Let me just very quickly sum this China thing up.
Sure, Dr.
Largely, there's a huge unwanted fear psychosis that develops around China's so-called hydro hegemony, which we should not really tom-tom about, I think. The whole idea is that you can't really change geography or the location of China. But interestingly, and it's quite good for the rest of the South Asian countries, that there's enough water really to work with. I think, therefore, instead of concentrating too much on what China is doing, it is important, therefore, for the lower riparian countries, including Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, to think about various cooperation to expand the water footprint in our part of the lower riparian space that we are in. A decade ago, I talked about a lower riparian coalition, but coalition is, is seen from a geopolitical perspective as a challenge to an upper hegemony. But I think a lower riparian interest-based cooperation is what we should think about. And there's a lot to do for South Asian countries there within the BBIN. For example, inland waterways is a crucial element which can tie the BBIN country. We are moving more towards power trade equation between Nepal and India, which again is a positive outcome. So there are many things that the lower riparian countries themselves can do, rather than constantly harp about what the Chinese are doing.
Thank you, Dr. Sinha. I mean, I quite agree with you. We done a short project on India-China water cooperation or non-cooperation, and we realize there's a lot of alarmism within this field of study. Dr. Dhungel, I saw you raising your hand. Please go ahead. If you could be very brief, that would be great, because we're
Thank you. Thank you. I had attended a meeting in Guwahati in terms of the use of Brahmaputra River for navigation. And one of the concerns expressed in that meeting, it was a sub-regional type of meeting, was the possibility of more interventions and causing downstream problem in Brahmaputra. A lot of infrastructures are being built, and literatures are available now on dams being built on the Brahmaputra, and that has created some sort of alarming, sent an alarming signal to downstream benefits. And this was, we felt it during our meeting in Guwahati, I think 2-3 years back. This is all I would like to say. Therefore, and also, I don't have the time to give you the data, certain percentage of the Ganga Basin area falls in Tibet also. And Arun, as Dipak has said, Arun is coming from Tibetan area, and Brahmaputra is a major river that is coming from Tibet, coming to India and going to Bangladesh and all the way to the sea. So there's much concern now. Therefore, I think because of this very much concern, India and China agreed to share the information, data information that shows that Tibet is getting importance in terms of the relationship, water relationship among the three countries, lower riparian countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dhungel. I think we have completely run out of time. This is a vast topic and a very multi-layered topic, but it's amazing how we did just over an hour, we covered so much ground. And I don't know about others, I learned a lot. This was a very insightful and also occasionally provocative session, which I think it should be. And it's amazing how nice Nepal always manages to get the best people on a particular topic. And I've been associated with it through Pramod, who was a former colleague. So it was lovely chairing this. It was very insightful and a privilege to chair this session. Thank you to all the speakers, and thank you to the audience for asking questions and engaging. And once again, thank you to the panelists who posted the literature on this. I think this is very useful for others. And with this, I will pass on the mic back to the organizers. Thank you.